All right, guys. I'm going to take a little bit of time and actually do a video of a video and upload it. The reason I'm doing it this way is because Steve Deace has a show on The Blaze, and he has a section called The Overtime. It's only available to subscribers, and I'm not going to assume that you're a subscriber. But the data, I think, is too good not to put forward. He's not the original source this time, although he has been accurate all through COVID. But he does give an analysis to the data that is his analysis, I think, is worth putting forward, essentially. But this is a macro view of data and revolving around mail-in votes, and I think it's pretty compelling, and I wanted to share it, and I hope you'll take time to watch. So here we go. Fast forward against some of this intro stuff.
I wouldn't just blindly take what I'm about to show you and share it with you. But it's because I already know that this data is accurate, that I'm actually thankful to whomever cultural husbandry is for figuring out how to quantify this for you in ways that we could previously not. So let us begin. The following information you're going to be seeing is provided by an anonymous data scientist and another anonymous individual who wrote a script to scrape the national ballot counting time series data off of the New York Times website, meaning to script out their data and how it should look in real time. All right. This is based on their proprietary Edison data source, which would ordinarily be impossible to access for people that are outside the press. If you remember in the 90s, Rush used to always talk about LexisNexis, and that's what people in the press had access to before we had the interwebs, like Twitter and other things, where you had like a private RSS feed that media members had. That's what he's able to do here because he's got access to this Edison data. All right. If you want to see this report, there's a link to it that he provides, okay? What we are going to be looking at will be time series analysis, and you're going to see that it's extremely difficult to create convincing synthetic times series data. By looking at the time series logs of the ballot counting process for the entire country, you can more easily spot if there's anything like fraud, meaning when did these votes come in and from where? When did they come in? One of the first things noticed while exploring the data set is that there seems to be an obvious pattern in the ratio of new Biden ballots to new Trump ballots. As you can see on this log plot, many of the counting progress updates, you see an almost constant ratio of Biden to Trump. It's such a regular pattern that we can actually fit a linear regression model to it with near perfect accuracy, barring some outliers. Meaning, let me pause here for a moment. Elections are symmetrical because human behavior rarely has oodles of outliers. We are not contrarians by nature. We are conformers by nature. We seek approval and validation of others. Birds of a feather flock together. We don't go out of our way to engage with or not be around people who share our viewpoints. And this is true of all ideologies within human nature. I mean, the reason Christ has to compel his followers to go into enemy territory and spread the gospel is because on their own, they're not going to want to go into enemy territory and spread the gospel. That's not how human nature acts. So that's why they're able to pull this model out, is because human behavior on an individual level can be random. But when we get together in groups, we conform to a group. That's what he's pointing out. So that leads me to the next post in this thread. He writes, how could this be possible? Is this a telltale sign of fraud? No, as I just explained to you, the opposite is true. It's not. Surprisingly, as it's going to be shown, the answer is no, he writes. This is actually expected behavior because, again, in groups, we conform to the group we're in, okay? Also, he says that you can use this weird pattern in the ballot counting to spot fraud. For example, you see this in Florida. You see the linear pattern again in Florida, and then you see it again in the exact same state. And again, you see this all over the country. What appears to be happening is that points on the straight line are actually the mail-in votes. The reason they're so homogenous across with respect to the ratio of Biden to Trump votes, and this is going to be one of the most important points we're going to make in this broadcast, is what's going to be said next. The reason they're so homogenous across with respect to the ratio of Biden versus Trump votes is that they get randomly shuffled in the mail. Randomly shuffled in the mail like a deck of cards. Since the ballots are randomly mixed during transport, like anything else you allegedly mail is, spanning areas occupied by multiple voting demographics, we can expect the ratio of mail-in Biden ballots to mail-in Trump ballots will remain relatively constant over time. Why? Because the same entity that's receiving the ballots is also who is sorting the ballots and delivering them. And they have a methodology of how they collect mail, how they then sort mail, and then how they deliver mail. And it all gets sorted together in the mail. That process is a constant. Now, different classifications of mail are sorted and delivered differently, but within that classification itself. There aren't outliers within a classification. In fact, the way that the post office operates, it seeks this homogeneous behavior so they can guarantee no matter rain nor sleet, no sun nor shine, we're there no matter what. The U.S. Postal Service. I feel like I'm doing the last scene of Miracle on 34th Street here. They want a homogeneous sorting and delivering methodology at the U.S. Postal Service. They seek that out. And it shows up in the aspect ratios here with the mail-in voting. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this. Here's a plot of the same Florida voting data, but this time it's the ratio of Biden to Trump ballots versus the time. What we see is that the initial ballot reportings are very noisy and random. Now, the initial reporting, though, represents in-person voting. These votes or these vote reports have such large variation because in-person voting happens across different geographic areas that have different political alignments, meaning some precincts within a county, counties within a state or a city, cities within a state, suburbs within a city. There's going to be variance within these particular local locations because we're not mail. We're not getting sorted into a homogeneous sorting structure in order for it to be delivered in a timely, prudent, reliable manner. We show up on a coffee break. We show up on a smoke break. We show up after work. We show up before work. We show up during work. So there might be a lot of people that agree with one another in a particular precinct where you go to vote, but they're not all voting at the same time. See what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
You show up at different times. And so that's why that data looks more random. Let's continue on. What we see in almost all examples across the country is that the ratio of mail-in Democrat to Republican ballots is very consistent across time, but with a notable drift from Democrat to slightly more Republican. And that's the way it should be because it's been put into a homogeneous sorting structure called the U.S. Postal Service. This slight drift from D to R mail-ins occurs again and again, and it's likely due to outlying rural areas having more Republican votes and the harder sorting process because they're outside geographically. So it takes the longest for their ballots to be sorted in and delivered. These outlying areas take longer to ship their ballots to the polling centers back and forth, so that makes sense. But now we're getting into the really good stuff. When we see mail-in ballot counting where there isn't relatively stable ratios of D and R ballots that slightly drift R, we have an anomaly. Anomalies themselves are not necessarily fraud, but they can help us to spot fraud more easily because you have to account for the anomaly. How do you have anomalies in a homogeneous structure? You have to trace that anomaly back, right? Well, let's look at some of these anomalies. Todd, this is your home state of Wisconsin. This is the vote counting history log, meaning time basis for when the votes occurred. Again, on the y-axis, we have the ratio of D to R ballots in the reporting batch. And on the x-axis, we have a reporting time. Now, around 4 a.m. there in Wisconsin, there is a marked shift in the ratio of D to R mail-in ballots. Based on other posts in this thread, this shouldn't happen. This is an anomaly. And while anomalies are not always fraud, often they may point to fraud. So what happened just before 3 a.m. in Wisconsin? I mean, do you typically go pick up your mail at 4 a.m. in Wisconsin? You grew up there. Is that typically the time you got to your mailbox? And the mail is in your box at 3 and 4 a.m.
That is not typical.
Hold on, your mic wasn't on. Say that again.
That is not typical, but what is typical is that a lot of anomalies, whether we're talking about this or otherwise, happen at 4 a.m. in my experience.
Yes, as the great Johnny Orr used to say, brother, hey, nothing good happens after 1 a.m., coach. Yes, exactly. All right. So around 3 a.m. Wisconsin time, a fresh batch of 169,000 new absentee ballots arrived there by cop car. They were supposed to stop accepting new ballots, by the way, because it was when the polls were closed. I guess these 169,000 people are just unawares of how the postal system works in the United States. They're new to this, not really sure how it works. By 4 a.m., the Democrat to Republican ratio with this delivery is now thrown way out of whack. And that is because these ballots were not sampled from the real Wisconsin voter population. They were not randomized in the mail sorting system with the other ballots. They inherently, therefore, have a different D to R signature. They're the anomaly here. They're here now to say, we had this pattern, and all along it showed us that the equation was 2 + 2 = 4. Well, those are the constant numbers. 2's a constant, 2's a constant, because it gets us the same answer every time. But then suddenly at 4 a.m. in Wisconsin, the answer suddenly becomes 2 + 2 is 8.3, 7, 14. Because we have 169,000 variables we didn't previously account for. Okay. Why weren't they sorted in the same mail as everything else? There's a reason they wouldn't all be sorted in the same mail as everything else. Or there's a few possible reasons. They're all bad. And the least nefarious reason is these 169,000 people don't know how to send mail. That's the least nefarious reason. Is that these 169,000 people don't know how to send mail. And they escalate to varying degrees of nefariousness from there. Let's continue. Let's look at another anomaly here. This is Pennsylvania's vote counting history. For the first part of the vote counting process, we see the same pattern for mail-in ballots that we've seen in every other state in the country, which is a relatively stable D to R ratio that gradually drifts R as more ballots come in from the rural outlying areas. Remember, I'm telling you, elections are symmetrical because human behavior in groups seeks to conform to the group it's in. This is why we get frustrated with things like binary choices, right? Because that's how we often see things. Is it my group or your group? How often on our show over the years we've been frustrated by people wanting to put us in a theological tribe, a political tribe, right? Because that is human nature. But then as the counting continues in Pennsylvania, the D to R ratio in mail-in ballots inexplicably begins increasing. It's a winter solstice miracle. Again, this should not happen, and it's observed almost nowhere else in the country because all of the other ballots are all randomly shuffled. In the mail system, there should be they should remain homogeneous during counting. The only exceptions to this are other suspected states or other suspect states that also have these anomalies. Again, this is evidence of ballot backdating, manufacturing of software tampering, like what you've seen with the COVID data, where we have this giant increase in deaths today, but when you go back and look at the dates of deaths, some were in May, some were in June, some were in July, some were last week. They weren't actually today, right?
Right.
So then why are they getting counted today? Could just be that the system just honestly just caught up But the narrative that is trying to politicize that system is lying to you, or the system itself is a lie. Either way, none of those options are particularly comforting, though, are they?
Not.
And that is what he's talking about here. They either held these ballots back, surprise, bitches, at the very end, and blitzkrieged you at the end. Why would you do that? Or they didn't. So I guess they're douchebags is the best case scenario here. Let's look at Georgia. We see pretty much the same story as Pennsylvania. Increasing fractions of mail-in Democrat ballots over time, even though this defies logic, not to mention human nature, and we see this pattern nowhere else in the country, but a few states that have a couple of counties, or one in particular, where it just so happens that the party that is on the receiving end of these mother loads has complete and total control of the entire vote counting apparatus, as well as the local political system that oversees it, which I'm sure is a coincidence. Let's continue. How about Michigan? There we see a combination of Wisconsin strangeness together with the Georgia-Pennsylvania weirdness. We see both signs of contaminated ballot dumping and ballot ratios drifting towards Democrats when they should not be. Now, let me go back. Can we go back to the Michigan thing? Let me reset this. Why are the cities that are the closest to the post office's infrastructure, why are they the ones that seem to be taking so much longer to get through the sorting process, to the point they're not being sorted at all, as opposed to these outlier rural areas where they don't even have Wi-Fi? That's the point he keeps making here.
Yeah, and somebody responded to this trying to blow it up by saying, yeah, well, this is bunk because I ran these numbers in New York, and it trends in New York, it trends towards Republicans. Actually, that's the point that he's making. Because the rural outlying,
the rural outlying areas are come last because they're rural. Remember when we all sat here in the Iowa caucuses waiting for that truck to return from Northwest Iowa in 2012 to find out if Rick Santorum won or not? Remember that?
Sure.
That's how this works. The areas that are closest to this, because we're also not talking about in-person voting. Remember that. If we were talking about in-person voting, and now you've got a mass coagulation, conglomeration of people in a local infrastructure that can't handle it, and you got to let all these people vote, and they're sitting in line, and the population density is overwhelming the system, that would be one thing, right?
Yes.
But that's not what we're talking about, is it? We're talking about mailing in ballots. What's more convenient than that? What's more convenient than that? And we're talking about a system that handles this every Christmas season. Perfectly fine for most Americans. So why were they able to pull off in-person voting in the right aspect ratio and with the proper timeliness, given all the infrastructure challenges that presents? But they couldn't do it with the most convenient process that already has a structure set up to import, sort, and manage and distribute this level of volume. Let's continue. Now, in fairness, Virginia is the only state out of the 50 that has is the only state out of the 50 that has anomalies, but has not had accusations of voter fraud yet. Remember, this though was the state I pointed out on election night. Fairfax County said, "Oh, sorry, we overcounted Joe Biden's vote by 100,000." Remember that? Okay. He said, "I think this is the exception that proves the rule. Yet to figure out what causes this anomalous shift here it is, so no one accuses me of holding it back." So let's wrap this up, meaning that he found a positive example. But keep in mind, though, Republicans didn't challenge in Virginia.
That's very key.
They should have, looking at the numbers, they should have contested there more. But Republicans weren't challenging in Virginia. Were they challenging in Pennsylvania?
Right.
Were they challenging in Wisconsin?
Right.
Were they challenging in Michigan?
Right.
Were they challenging in Georgia?
Right.
Did they put up any kind of fight in Virginia? No. So that's how I would answer that example. So what you showed me were Georgia, Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Virginia, 6 states, right? You showed me 6 states, and in 5 of them, Republicans were contesting. And in 4 of them, the Democrats, one of those 5 that were being contested, there were anomalies in all 4 of them between what the ratio is of the sorting system and voting in person. You know what the odds are that it would be all 4? Organically? Not high. Because remember, folks, it isn't the political parties or the Secretary of State's office that has to sort the mail-in ballots. Who's doing the sorting? The post office is. Do they have some experience with sorting volumes and mass? Yes. I mean, pretty much doesn't the mail show up at your house almost every day at the same time, thereabouts? So it should have been extremely uniform in terms of D versus R ratio, with the drift slightly to R because of those outlying areas in the rurals. Every state with major pockets of urban population then. Why didn't we see this in Ohio, Texas, and Florida, or even Missouri with St. Louis and Kansas City? Where were all the late vote dumps from major cities in those states to tilt the election? Why didn't it happen then everywhere? See what I'm saying?
Yes.
Why just in these unique places? Why didn't it happen everywhere? Fine, I'll throw out Missouri. Maybe Democrats thought they couldn't win that state. Did they contest Ohio? Joe Biden went there like the second to last day of the campaign. Yeah.
Same region of the country, too.
Same region of the country, too. Thank you, Aaron. Certainly they were contesting Florida, right?
Oh, yes.
Texas. Kamala Harris was there, I believe, the second to last day of the campaign. Didn't she go there?
Right.
Democrats spent an ungodly sum of money in Texas the last few years, trying to at least make some inroads in the state legislature with redistricting about to take place. They got nothing out of the state. Nothing. Why? Where were the truckloads of late mail? Like if you follow Texas, people are texting me, man, Biden's been winning Texas this whole time. And then we get to the outlying areas, the rural parts of the state, when it happens, it gets swamped by Trump, right? Where was the late voter dumps out of Houston and Texas? I'm sorry, out of Houston and Dallas. Almost the entire margin Barack Obama won Ohio by in 2008 and 2012 were in 2 counties, Cuyahoga and Hamilton counties. Why didn't they do that again in 2020 then? And I mean, Trump ended up winning the state by about as much, if not more, than he won it 4 years ago. Because their explanation, I believe, is, and we'll get to this in a second too, but their explanation is, well, these are predominantly black precincts angry about the president's racism, and that's what created this unique backlash where a white guy, an 80-year-old white guy from Delaware, actually got higher turnout in these areas than Barack Obama got twice, right? That's the explanation, the narrative they're giving us, right?
Yes.
Then why didn't we see it in Ohio? Why didn't we see it in Florida? Why didn't we see it in Texas? Other places that they were contesting on the other side. We didn't see this there. What's so unique about these handfuls of counties in these particular states that they were able to roll snake eyes here? Here's the next big takeaway from the data we just showed you. How is it possible that Trump gained 7 points apiece with black men and black women across the board, according to the exit polling? But these particular locales of largely minority voters are uniquely against him. For example, we see a symmetrical pattern of Trump's weakness with white suburbanites in both the exits and the results. So why don't we see that here? Meaning that you saw Trump win suburbanites in 2016, but perform historically bad for a Republican, right? Mm-hmm. You saw Trump get destroyed, or Republicans get destroyed in the suburbs in 2018 in the midterms, right?
Right.
This time around, you saw Trump perform even weaker in the suburbs than he did 4 years ago. And so there's a congruence, a symmetry between that shows up in the exit polling and I see it on the real-time results. They line up, right? Here you're telling me this guy got more non-white voters than any Republican has in 60 years, but just in these particular places, they just were uniquely pissed, uniquely angry, that they just so happened to overload him when that didn't work in any of these other contested states. Totes legit, bro. That sound legit to you?
No, this is the least legit of all of the points.